Okay, today I'm very happy to introduce Professor Jess Son. First of all, I want to thank you for accepting our invitation. I'm very happy because for us, this is the first lecture on Korean arts, so it will be very interesting. Jess Son is currently a researcher at SOAS University of London. She has an academic background in international studies, fine arts, and East Asian arts history and Korea University in Korea and SOAS University of London. And she has recently finished her doctoral thesis, which studies the role of visual representation of the Korean nation state from the 1880s to the 1910s. She's also working as a curator and project manager for various art exhibitions. She's currently involved in so-called ESRC, SOAS Research Project, that is Economics and Social Research Council. Her major contribution for this project is named Art and Soft Power in the UK and South Korea. She is also working for a research project funded by the Overseas Korean Cultural Heritage Foundation with the aim to investigate Korean art collecting activities of British diplomats, businessmen, and missionaries in the 1880s to the 1930s. So today her talk is Visualizing the Nation, Korean landscape of the 1880s to the 1910s. So I will give the floor to you. Thank you again.
Thank you. First of all, I would like to thank Professor Imsuk Chung for having me here today, and of course to the audience for taking your time out and coming to hear my talk today. Also, welcome to those of you who are joining us on YouTube, who are live streaming. Yes, so very nice to meet you. So my background is on Korean art history, and today I'll be talking a little bit about a part of my recent doctoral thesis, and I've titled it "Visualizing the Nation: Korean Landscapes of the 1880s to the 1910s." Among a wide range of landscapes, I'm going to be focusing on cityscapes of Seoul, Kumgangsan Mountain, and Pectusa Mountain. So, just to give you a little bit of a historical background, I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with early modern Korean history, but basically after a very long period of an isolation policy, in the late 19th century, Joseon Korea opened its ports in 1876 to Japan and signed a series of international treaties with Western nations from the 1880s. And from the late 19th century, Korea had begun to realize the need to separate itself from China after centuries of maintaining a tributary relationship. And with this new world order, Korea had to really prove its independence, and not just in international relations, but also in the creation of a new national image. And in my PhD thesis, I touched upon various points of state and nation building agendas using visual imagery. But today I'm going to spend some time talking about the formulation of modern national landscape imagery and their contextual impact in constructing a new national image at the turn of the 20th century. So there were so many different socio-political changes that really took place at the turn of the 20th century. And you could say that it was a time of disarray, but it was also a very exciting time of transformation. And in this setting, the Joseon state and intellectuals really embarked on a series of state and nation building agendas. And public education and popular recognition of territory, national territory, was one of the most important objectives for the state and intellectuals. The reason why is because the recognition of national borders, national territory, that really induced a sense of collective belonging and national identity for the Korean people. Right, so for the individual, for the common man, national territory is always an abstract idea, right? The average person cannot realistically perceive and experience the scope of the nation state without the help of secondary and symbolic representation of territory in a much smaller and abbreviated scale. Images of landscapes can therefore be powerful tools to represent a nation state because their reality can be experienced. And the selection and promotion of these representative landscapes and the embedding of those images into nationalistic narratives and political narratives can effectively induce personal identification with national territory to trigger pride, melancholy, or even aesthetic appreciation. In the case of Korea, cityscapes of Seoul, Kumgangsan Mountain, and Pectusa Mountain all provided tangible references to the territory and the placeness of the Korean nation state. To begin with Seoul, the capital city of Korea, Seoul had always been the capital city for the dynastic Joseon. And traditionally, it was the 5 main palaces of Seoul that were the key landmarks of the city. And of course, Seoul had various different names, including, but not limited to, Hansong and Gyeongsong. But keep in mind that Gyeongsong was mainly used after annexation, after Japanese colonization of Korea after 1910. The centrality and the symbolic power of the capital city of Korea was really intensified towards the late 19th century, as visual imagery of Seoul were mass-produced and disseminated as a result of the import of Western technology, mainly print technology, and also photography. Photography and mass reproduction of imagery was really central to implementing Western and modern customs of recording and consuming landscape. And landscape photographs standardized various different images of place, and it also increased indirect accessibility to these locations to a larger population. And this really allowed for the collective recognition and identification with these representative national sceneries. After 1900, it was really photographic postcards that enabled this accessibility of imagery. In the 1880s and 1890s, cityscapes of Seoul or Hansong were predominantly consumed by foreign audiences. And most of these images were photographs taken by foreign visitors. And many of them were published in early books on Korea that really introduced Korea to the Western world and audiences. And images of palace grounds and city gates that exposed the traditional city of the newly opened Joseon Kingdom were especially popular. Western visitors who published images were also immediately aware of the importance of Hansong as the capital city. And these are some of the most popular images that were published first in the UK and then also America and the rest of Europe as well. During this time, it was also a time when new and modern Korean textbooks began to be published, and they also began to emphasize the importance of the capital city in representing the Korean nation state. They often included illustrations of Hansong's high streets and also the gates of Seoul that really closely resembled Western photographic cityscapes. In addition to the importance placed on the capital city, they also retained an element of traditional feng shui. So they also commented on the auspicious location of the city in relation to its surrounding mountains and rivers that are all very expressive of traditional Chosun conceptions of geography. So it's kind of a mixture between the new and the old. Most cityscapes used in these textbooks were of prominent palaces or city grounds, but they also included natural features surrounding Seoul. For instance, this 1909 geography textbook contains a detailed map and illustrations of the mountains of Hanyang, or Hansong, and also includes humorous notes that kind of compare them to the likeness of different objects. But as you can see, these kind of illustrations, they very closely resemble photographic takes. So you can see that there's a growing influence of Western media in artistic expression at this time. For those of you who are not aware, there was a very brief period when Korea was an empire. And during this time, King Gojong basically elevated the Joseon dynasty into an empire, and he embarked on a reconstruction of the city. And he also created modern institutions that were all placed within the city gates that really intensified the centrality of Hansong as a capital city. And during this period, Gyeongungung Palace served as the primary palace of Emperor Gojong. And the new imperial city, or Hwangsong, developed with Gyeongungung Palace at its center. And this was a very strategic and political tactic to curb increasing Japanese powers during this time, because Gyeongungung Palace and its surroundings were close to the region where Western legations were placed, whereas the southern area was where Japanese residents were living. And to differentiate the new imperial city from pre-modern Hansong, Gojong also embraced modern architecture, most symbolically by commissioning the construction of Seokjojeon Hall, which was a modern stone building that was originally constructed to serve as a new central hall of Gyeongungung Palace. And this is the image of the Seokjojeon Hall. It's still there, by the way. If you visit Seoul, you can still see it. It's an art museum now. And palace grounds were also symbolically expanded through the construction of Hangudan altar. This altar was basically erected to celebrate the elevation of Korea from kingdom to empire. It's also where King Gojong, or Emperor Gojong, held his imperial coronation in 1897. New roads and commercial areas were also formed with Gyeongungung Palace at the center. And this really kind of changed the cityscape of Seoul during this period. Another development that took place during this period was that the city came to kind of have new contact zones between the state and all the people. So, for example, this image on the right is Daehanmun Gate, which is a gate, the central gate for Gyeongungung Palace. And this gate became the kind of meeting ground for people, especially during national holidays or national events. And so these kind of public arenas came into being during this period. Despite these modernization agendas by the Korean state and the changes in the cityscape of Seoul, Japanese authorities gradually gained control of shaping the image of Seoul after or towards colonization. The transformation of Seoul from Hansong or Hwangsong to Gyeongsang had a profound impact on what the capital really represented. The identity of the colonized capital was manipulated through images that were distributed by the Japanese authorities, mostly postcards, because they were accessible and affordable for the ordinary public. And the cityscape of Seoul also evolved, I guess, with Japanese governance. Primarily, the new government general building was established in Gyeongbokgung Palace in 1926. And the Japanese authorities also constructed a botanical garden and a zoo and a museum in Changgyeongbong Palace. And also they demolished the Hwanggodan altar that was constructed by Gojong. So this image over here is of the zoological garden in Changgyeongbong Palace. If you visit Changgyeongbong Palace right now, you can see some of the remains of this structure. It's actually quite popular nowadays because in the evenings they would open it up to the public, and they would, it's a very Instagrammable place, right? So a lot of people take photographs. But this was basically how the Japanese authorities kind of marketed these new developments. So they basically opened up palace grounds that were always forbidden before, and they made it into like an entertainment ground for the public. So these kind of changes altered and desacralized, in a way, these traditional Joseon palaces, which were spaces that really used to symbolize the authority of the monarchy. And they eventually became relics of past history rather than a symbol of power. And the colonial government, as well as private photo studios, mostly Japanese photo studios, disseminated many photographic postcards from the 1910s and 1920s that flaunted the new image of Gyeongsang. It promoted visits to newly opened palace grounds for entertainment and also assimilated Gyeongsang as part of the territory of Imperial Japan. For instance, these photographs of Kunjangjang-ho and Injangjang-ho were all very, very new images because the public typically would never have had access to these images. They would never have been able to see these very private, authoritative grounds of the palace. And this was a major, major change in how the public perceived palace grounds and also the authority of the powerless monarchy after colonization. After annexation, a major, major change in the cityscape of Seoul is that the southern area of Seoul became a stronger symbol of the capital city. As I mentioned before, the southern area of Seoul was where Japanese residents and Japanese establishments were located. And particularly after annexation, there were much more images of southern Seoul, the southern part of Seoul, rather than northern old Seoul. So during the colonial period, there was this clear disparity and distinction between the northern area of Seoul and the southern area of Seoul. And moving beyond the capital, just to begin with Pectusa Mountain, natural landscapes were also really central to the visual culture of pre-modern Joseon. Traditional Taoist and Confucian teachings that really underpin the culture of dynastic Joseon emphasize the need for life in harmony with nature. And capturing landscapes and its symbolisms was a crucial part of Neo-Confucian literati culture and artistic practice as well. So landscape paintings of local Korean scenery continue to be produced throughout the Joseon period. In particular, from the late Joseon period, the painting of local Korean scenery, rather than the conceptual and idealized landscapes of China, grew in popularity in light of a general push for cultural autonomy that flourished from King Sukjong to King Cheongjo's reigns. This was a period when Qing China was in control of China, and during this period, the Joseon kings, they assumed the role of Little China. So they assumed the role of continuing Ming's role in preserving Chinese culture and Neo-Confucian traditions. So this cultural autonomy really flourished during this period. And so this really gave birth to this real or true view landscape paintings. In Korean, we call them 실경산수 or 진경산수. There's a very slight difference between the two. But basically, true view landscape or 진경산수화, it is basically realistically depicting real sceneries, but also embedding it with artistic creativity and capturing the essence of the scenery. So it's not just honestly depicting the scenery, but it's perceiving the reality of the scenery. And in the 18th century, very, very celebrated painter Jung Son developed what is now referred to as Trueview Landscape. And from this period, depicting local Korean landscapes became the mainstream of artistic practice of landscape painting in Korea. And prominent late Joseon artists like Kang Se-hwang or Kim Hong-do, maybe some of you know Kim Hong-do, they also incorporated Western style realism. So they started to implement perspective and depth into the paintings as well. And among various subjects of natural landscapes, mountains were really central to the landscape painting culture of Korea. This is really kind of natural because the Korean peninsula, I don't know if you've been, but it's very, very mountainous. So there's a lot of mountains. But among the hundreds of different mountains in Korea, Kumgangsan Mountain or the Diamond Mountains is undeniably the most popular. So, Kumgangsan Mountain. There's so much to say about Kumgangsan Mountain, but the name Kumgangsan Mountain had many different names according to the season, but also according to what view you're looking at. But the name Kumgangsan Mountain was predominantly used because it has a Buddhist context. So for many generations, Kumgangsan Mountain was known to be a sacred Buddhist site. Right? But the exceptional beauty of the mountain really inspired countless paintings, poems, literatures, and even ceramic designs throughout the Joseon period. But surviving paintings are largely from the late Joseon period. In particular, from the 18th century, tourism to Kumgangsan Mountain became really immensely popular. And it was mostly the Yangban elite that could afford to go on these lengthy and expensive journeys to the mountain. But when they did, they often brought with them professional painters. So, professional artists who would accompany them, and they would, so the Yangban literati would write poems, and the painters would sit beside them and draw the scenery, right? And the reason why they did that was because of personal enjoyment. So they would produce these poem/painting albums, and they would bring it back to Seoul, and they would read it or look at it over and over again. So it's comparable to what we now to do with kind of recording videos or taking photographs. It's the same thing that they did, right? And Jung Son, obviously, he painted Trueview landscapes of Kumgangsan Mountain as early as 1711. And Kim Hong-do also painted over 100 paintings of Kumgangsan Mountain and the general region of Gangwon-do province at the commission of the king. So even the king wanted to, visit or see the Kumgangsan Mountain. And particularly toward the late Joseon period, Kumgangsan Mountain was no longer reserved for the Yangban elite, but ordinary people could also indirectly access Kumgangsan Mountain through these minhwa or genre painting, so the kind of folk painting. Art historians generally describe them as being of lesser quality than literati painting, but I think the general trend of art history is nowadays it's a bit changing. So minhwa is a very, very big topic, and it's very well studied. But the important thing is that the rise of these genre paintings or minhwa, they really amplified accessibility of not just paintings in general, but of Kumgangsan Mountain as a location. So because traveling to Kumgangsan Mountain was popular, but it was still very expensive, not many ordinary non-elite people could visit Kumgangsan. And the way that they indirectly experienced that was through paintings and poems. And there are many records toward the late 19th century that Western visitors saw ordinary commoners' houses being decorated with these genre paintings of Kumgangsan Mountain or Korean landscapes. So you can see that this kind of demand for landscape imagery was really, really high toward the late 19th century. And also beware that although Joseon was a stratified society and there were classes of different people, toward the 19th century, all of that kind of broke down. So there was massive social reformation. And the common class, sometimes they were actually more wealthier than some of the impoverished Yangban classes. So there was this kind of disparity between the classes and the actual accessibility of images. But the influence of Kumgangsan Mountains as a symbol of Korean national territory really thrived once Western forms of visual media was introduced after the opening of ports. And a lot of Western visitors to Korea, they brought with them cameras, right? And they, took back these pictures that they took with their cameras and they published it abroad and they introduced Korea through these landscape images. And although for the Joseon people, Kumgangsan Mountain had a very big meaning in terms of cultural history, for these Western visitors, it was a form of enjoyment going to these mountains, right? It was an entertainment, it was sightseeing, it was tourism. And that is the way that these images were consumed generally, particularly of the Kumgangsan Mountain. It's a bit different to Pectusa Mountain, which I'll mention a bit later. But nevertheless, many of these early Western visitors, they were also very aware of what Kumgangsan Mountain really meant to the Joseon people. And so in their descriptions, they included a lot of informational notes of the mountain. And for example, this long, very long quote is by Isabella Bird Bishop, and she's a very, very famous Scotswoman. So she's from Scotland, and she traveled across the world, and she wrote many books, and I think she even also painted. She was an amateur artist as well, and in her book, she basically explains that traveling to Kumgangsan Mountain was very, very popular, and it was still something to boast about in Seoul. So if you meet up with your friends, and you say that, oh, I went to Kumgangsan Mountain last month, then you would be, the most popular person in your group, right? So you can see that when she visited Korea at the end of the 19th century, touring Kumgangsan Mountain was still, to an extent, very scarce. So it was quite expensive, right? And this, of course, changes after annexation. And Charles William Campbell was vice consul to Korea. He was also British. And he arrived in Seoul in 1887 as well. So he was one of the early visitors to Korea. And he distinguishes, in his book, the strong Buddhist connotation or the Buddhist significance of the mountain. And once more, the popularity of Kumgangsan Mountain is really emphasized. But it's very interesting because in his book, he mentions the Tambalyong Hills, which is a specific site within the mountain. And he basically explains that it's a very, very popular scenic spot for visitors who go to the mountain. And this is very important because in the early 20th century, the most representative image of the Kumgangsan Mountain becomes the view of the 12,000 peaks as seen from Tambalyong Hills. So it's reflecting this tradition of these scenic spots. But although Western media and Western visitors really did impact the new creation of representative images of Kumgangsan Mountain, it was still, at the end of the 19th century, it was still genre painting or folk painting that was the most accessible form of Kumgangsan Mountain imagery. And these genre paintings were mostly highly stylized patterns in depicting the mountains, typically of this 내금강, 외금강, 해금강 course. So it's a course that you follow when you typically visit the Kumgangsan Mountain. They're not true to form. Like I said, genre painting is not completely accurate, but it simplifies and stylizes the distinctive features of Kumgangsan Mountain and also kind of exaggerates them to an extent. And in these genre paintings, you can see the continued popularity of Cheongsan or Kimongdo styles that continued from the late Joseon period, or mid-Joseon and the late Joseon period. So, mostly after 1905 is when print imagery of Kumgangsan Mountain really began to thrive. This is because this was when printing facilities were kind of established in Korea. So at the end of the 19th century, there were very, very few modern printing houses in Korea. The few that existed in Seoul were mostly run by either Europeans or Japanese residents in Korea. So, but from 1905, the Korean state basically started to import printing presses, and they began kind of producing these modern textbooks. And this image over here is a very famous illustration that was included in a textbook by Hyuntae. It's called Union Pildo. This textbook was very, very nationalistic in its narratives, and it was banned by the Japanese authorities in 1909. And during this period, textbooks were not only reserved for students who were enrolled in schools, it was also used by members of the general public for public edification. So what that means is it wasn't just used for classroom activities or classroom lectures, but it was a popular book that ordinary people would also want to read. And in this depiction is the typical 12,000 peaks as seen from Tambalyong Hills. So the similar images to this were repeatedly disseminated during this period. And what that did is it basically standardized what you would imagine when you think of Kumgangsan Mountain. And that gave these kind of images power as a symbol. Right? And of course, if you read this quote, you can see the very nationalistic narrative. So Hyuntae, the author, he basically, by describing these natural features, these prominent popular features of the mountain, he's basically emphasizing the need to love the mountain, the need to love national territory. So he's kind of embedding this sense of patriotism to the reader, which was the ultimate goal of the intellectuals at this time. The ultimate goal was to educate the people, the Korean people, to learn to love their country. Right? the reason why these nation-building agendas were so important during this time was because Korea was obviously facing immense threat to sovereignty, right? So obviously, eventually they were annexed, but in the very beginning years of the 20th century, this was the major ultimate, very, very pressing goal for the elite, for the social elite, to educate the public, right? And similar formats of the 12,000 Peaks were repeatedly produced in other different textbook imagery. Photographs really began to be popularized after annexation. Although photographs were disseminated before annexation, it was really after annexation that these Japanese printers and Japanese photo studios began to be established within Korea, and they began to disseminate very affordable, small, postcard-sized photographs. Right? And they also reflected these famous views from the scenic spots. And it wasn't just photographs that were produced during this time. Traditional painting also continued. And even after annexation, Korean artists really continued these Joseon traditions of painting Kumgangsan Mountain and its scenery. And one famous painter was Kim Gyujin. And Kim Gyujin is a very, very interesting figure. I don't know if you guys know, but he was a painter, calligrapher, and he was also a photographer. And he was commissioned by King Sunjong to paint the Kumgangsan mural in Hejeongdang-ho in Changdeokgung Palace. It's not in the palace now, it's in the Changdeokgung Museum, Gogong National Palace Museum of Korea. But it's a very, very large piece, and it's a very panoramic view of the Kumgangsan Mountain. And this kind of format was really influenced by photography at the time. So although this particular painting, this mural, was painted in the traditional court-style blue and green painting style, it also incorporated these modern new forms of visual imagery. Kim Gyujin also produced these sketches that were published in a series of articles in Mail-Shinbo, which was a newspaper which was published by the colonial government. And these series of sketches basically introduced to their readers of different elements of the mountains. And they obviously promoted Kumgangsan Mountain as a site for tourism. And this was really important during the colonial period because for the colonial authorities, Kumgangsan Mountain was not an origin of pride necessarily. It was more of a source of economic benefit, right? So developing mass tourism to the mountains could bring the colonial government a lot of revenue, right? So they established these modern railways to the mountains that facilitated access to the mountain, and a lot of Japanese private companies would set up these tour guides of the mountains, and they kind of exploited all of that, which is why there was so much emphasis on promoting Kumgangsan Mountain during the colonial period. But also contemporary intellectuals, they embedded within the mountain these ideas of national pride as well. So it was a simultaneous phenomenon. And most notably, it was Choi Nam-son. Choi Nam-son is a historian. I think some of you may know him, but he emphasized the need to travel to Kumgangsan Mountain if you love Korea, right? If you love your country, you should know Kumgangsan and you should visit Kumgangsan. I'm sorry I'm whizzing through this, but and I know there's a lot of text in my slides. But eventually, Kumgangsan Mountain, it was really influenced. The promotion of Kumgangsan Mountain was really influenced by the colonial government, And what the colonial government did was they repackaged Kumgangsan Mountain as if it was newly discovered by the Japanese authorities. And one of the ways in which they did that was they renamed these famous spots. So, for example, they renamed Kumgangsan to Kongosan. And they also renamed these Manmulcho rocks into Shin Manmulcho rocks, so new Manmulcho rocks, as if it was newly discovered. And this was just a way of marketing tours to Kumgangsan Mountain. It was nothing new. Everyone knew it was there. It was always famous, but it was just a way of marketing the mountain. Right. I'm just going to whiz through some of these slides, but some Western visitors also kind of painted famous spots of Kumgangsan Mountain. I kind of want to mention this this painter, Elizabeth Keith. She's a very, very interesting figure. She traveled East Asian countries in the early 20th century, and she produced these watercolor paintings of landscapes. And then later on, she turned those paintings into woodblock prints. So she incorporated Japanese-style colored woodblock prints, and she disseminated these images that were hugely popular in Europe, right? In Europe and of course, eventually the United States. But this was one of the ways in which non-Koreans, Westerners, gained access to these kind of images. So quickly moving on to Pectusa Mountain. Pectusa Mountain, I'm sure you know Pectusa Mountain if you study Korean, but it is the tallest mountain on the Korean peninsula, and it's located at the very northern border of Korea and China, right? And throughout Korean history, Pectusa Mountain was always revered as a very holy site. From the Goryeo period, actually, because according to legend, Goryeo, the founding king of Goryeo, was born in Pectusan, so it was kind of sacralized from the Goryeo period. But during the Goryeo period, Pectusa Mountain was actually not part of Korean territory, and it was kind of inhabited by Jurchens at the time. And during King Sejong's reign, Sejong, right? You know, everyone knows King Sejong. During King Sejong's reign, he basically expanded Korean territory so that it included Pectusa Mountain. But because Pectusa Mountain is the terrains are very severe, and it's not well suited for residency, right? So it was very hard to maintain control over the area. So it was always a disputed area, especially the northern part of Pectusa Mountain. But nevertheless, in Joseon maps, Pectusa Mountain was always depicted. So it was always part of the conceptual idea of Joseon territory. And in these pictorial maps, Pectusa Mountain was always emphasized, and it was exaggerated in maps, which really attests to the symbolic importance of the mountain in formulating the idea of Korean territory. So as you can see here, this white mountain is Pectusan, and you can also see the lake, Cheonji Lake, at the peak of the mountain. And this is always how the mountain was depicted in pictorial maps. Right. So in the late 16th century, there was this continued dispute over territory between China and Korea. But eventually, in 1712, there was a consensus met between the two countries, and it was basically agreed that Jumangang River and Amrokgang River and the Pectusan Mountain would be markers of territory. And so on this year, this Pectusan stele was erected on Pectusa Mountain to mark this consensus of territory. Right? Unfortunately, this stele is now lost. It was lost sometime during the colonial period. What is very important about the stele is that in the 18th century, this need for territorial consciousness was really on the rise. So as I mentioned before, this was a time when cultural autonomy was really pushed by the state and intellectuals or the elite because of this the continuation of Ming traditions by Korea. And that was also extended to national territory. And from this point on, maps of the Korean Peninsula, it continuously emphasized Pectusa Mountain as part of Chosun territory. And the narrative of Pectu Dega mountain range was also hugely popular toward the late Chosun period. The Pectu Dega mountain range narrative is basically a description of the Korean Peninsula as an organic form. So it basically compares Pectusan as the head of the country, and the mountain range would be the spine of the peninsula. And so that really placed the emphasis on Pectusa Mountain as the most symbolic mountain of the Korean Peninsula. And in the very late 19th century, Western visitors also visited the Pectusa Mountains. Surprisingly, if you look at records, it's interesting to see that not a lot of Koreans actually visited Pectusa Mountain. It was a lot of Westerners who were really intrigued by the mountain. And I think, for me, I think it was because the study of geography was a really, really big issue in the 19th century in Europe and the States because of this kind of expansionism. As European countries started to colonize different areas of the world, this geographic study and scholarship really grew. And this interest was reflected in the Western visitors' visit to these very specific mountains. And Pectusa Mountain is interesting for a reason. It's a very uncommon type of mountain. It's a volcanic mountain, but it's also got a lake at the top. It also has a very white mountain surface, which is not due to the snow, but it's just due to the sediment of the mountain. And that natural feature really attracted a lot of Western and particularly British visitors. Obviously, during this time, Britain was at the center of geographic exploration. So Campbell, again, he visited Pectusa Mountain from the Chinese side, and he published a book called The Long White Mountain, and this is where the image is from. And he also reflected this kind of geographic interest in the mountain. This is another set of images that were produced by Western visitors during this time. And most of them, as you can see, it depicts the view of the Cheonji Lake, right? Because it's the most distinctive image, landscape image of the mountains. In contrast to this very heated interest, this Western interest in Pectusa Mountain was rarely depicted in traditional Chosun paintings. It was mostly Kumgangsan Mountain that was the most popular. And one of the realistic reasons is because it was really, really difficult to climb. The weather is really severe. It's also very steep, very dangerous as well. And as I mentioned, it wasn't just Koreans who inhabited the mountain. There were always some level of Chinese population. So in a way, it was a little bit dangerous to travel as well. But there are these few exceptions. And in the 20th century, again, print imagery of Kumgangsan Mountain was really slow to develop, especially compared to Kumgangsan Mountain. And this is the only textbook that has an image of the Pectusa Mountain. And you can see the small Cheonji Lake in this illustration. And the Pectusa Mountain stele that is depicted in this illustration as well. So it's from the same textbook. again, this textbook is very, very nationalistic in its narrative. It emphasizes the pride of the Pectusa Mountain, of the Korean people when they think of the Pectusa Mountain. And it promotes this kind of association with patriotism and territory. But the most important phenomenon that took place during this period was the association of Pectusa Mountain with Tangun. I don't know if you guys are familiar with Tangun, but Tangun is basically thought of as the ethnic progenitor of Korean nation. So he basically is the father of the Korean people. And all of the Korean descendants basically originate from his bloodline, right? And this was there's no historical ground for this. I mean, it's a historic reinterpretation of some of the ancient records. And it was a new phenomenon that really took place at the turn of the 20th century. Before that, it was mainly Kita, who was thought of as the father of the Korean nation. But Kita, the reason why Kita vanished from Korean history is because Kita was known to be of Chinese descent, right? So during the time when Korea was trying to promote itself as a very autonomous and independent country, especially from China, Kita had to be erased from historical narratives, and Tangun became the sole father of the Korean nation. And the way that they promoted Tangun was that they tied him with the Pectusa Mountain as this legendary figure who descended from the mountains. And this emphasis on Tangun was really led by these historians like Choi Nam-sun or Shin Chae-ho, who continuously promoted not the worship of Tangun, but the veneration of Tangun as the father, as the ethnic father. And of course, during this period is when Natsal founded this religion that centers around the worshipping of Tangun. This Tangun-gyo it still exists in Korea, right? But it wasn't just the historians; it was also the social elite at this time that was basically trying to promote this cultural and historical awareness of the Korean people. And 동아일보 and 조선일보, which were the two main Korean newspapers during the colonial period, they continuously held tours and expeditions to the mountain. They also published photographs and images of the Pectusa Mountain in their articles that really promoted the awareness of the Pectusa Mountain. But again, the Japanese authorities really gained control of all the narratives that really took place during this period because there was immense censorship of media and press until 1920, right? So during the colonial period, the early years of the colonial period was very extreme censorship. So almost no Korean newspapers were existent at the time. Many of them were kind of blacked out when something sensitive was published. And it was only in the 1920s when the Japanese authorities began this cultural rule, when they allowed a little bit more freedom of expression and freedom of press. And from this period, the Japanese authorities, they allowed the promotion of Kumgangsa Mountain and also Pectusa Mountain because it brought to them economic revenue, right? So it was mostly Japanese photographers and Japanese newspapers that disseminated these images, these photographs of Pectusa Mountain. And this one is by Yamahana Yoshiyuki, who is a Japanese photographer, and he basically is currently known as the earliest photographer of Pectusa Mountain. But recently, Choi Hyun-sik also discovered some earlier photographs, but they are not credited, so no one really knows who took these photographs. But the way that the Japanese authorities promoted Pectusa Mountain was very different from how the Koreans wanted to promote it. Pectusa Mountain was promoted in this context of the 5 races under one union, or the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, which was basically a movement that the Japanese colonists tried to justify their control of not just Korea, but also their other colonies like Taiwan, right, and Manchukuo. So they promoted this idea that all these countries under the Japanese governance are one, so we are one, right? And Pectusa was part of that. So they tied Pectusa in with Mount Fuji. So they argued that Mount Fuji was connected, right, to the Pectusa Mountain, and so the Korean people and the Japanese people are also connected. And this was the predominant way that the Japanese authorities and Japanese residents consumed images of Pectusa Mountain, especially toward the later colonial period, when Japan really intensified these assimilation policies. But despite these Japanese contexts, Korean independence activists also utilized Pectusa Mountain and its imagery in independence movements. And a lot of independence movements visited Pectusa Mountain as a way to basically remind themselves of and re-motivate themselves to continue fighting for Korean independence. And the reason why is because they thought that if the Korean people, like the Tangun nationalists argue, derived from the Pectusa Mountain, they needed to have they needed to place the mountain at the forefront of their independence movements to recover the independence of the nation. Right? So I think I timed this quite well, but so in conclusion, these landscapes, or these prominent landmarks of Seoul, Kumgangsan Mountain, and Pectusa Mountain, they provided really tangible examples of Korean territory. Like I mentioned, national territory is not something that anyone can directly experience. And people always need secondary and simplified points of reminders to basically indirectly experience national territory. And early photographs and illustrations and paintings of the 20th century, they kind of reveal the different ways that these images were created and also consumed. What I find interesting is that there were many contrasting ways that this really happened. And I think that is owing to several different reasons. But first of all, it's to do with the introduction of new media. So the introduction of photography, of mass print, and also Western media like oil painting, watercolor painting, all these different new technologies, they were introduced to Korea, and they kind of diversified the ways in which these images were created. Another reason behind that is because of the socio-political changes that took place, the abolition of the class system, the modernization of the education system, right? All these different socio-political changes really gave way to new consumptions of imagery, right? So it was no longer the social elite that monopolized the production and consumption of the images, but the pool of the consumers was hugely expanded during this period. And another final one is the basically the threat to sovereignty, I think. The threat to Korean sovereignty, it was obviously very tragic, right? But it also meant that there were very drastic change to the political interests of not only the Korean state, but also its surrounding countries and European powers. And that, I think, led to the diversification of imagery and the way that they're consumed. I think it's also meaningful. The study of these images during this period is very meaningful because it has shaped the way that we think of Korean landscapes today. It still is very, very relevant. So even now, if you talk to a Korean and you ask them to give you a few representative landmarks or landscapes of Korea, they would probably give you the same things that I gave you today, right? They would probably give you more recent photographs of Seoul, right? Probably one of the palaces, I'm assuming. And also Kumgangsan. Well, Kumgangsan nowadays it's a bit different because it's now located in North Korea. But I think many people would still argue that Kumgangsan Mountain and Pectusa Mountain are the most representative natural landscapes of Korea. I don't know if you guys have ever watched the videotape of the Korean national anthem. It plays every day when all the broadcasting stations are kind of closed. But again, I think one of the first scenes that they show you is Pectusa Mountain, right? And Kumgangsan Mountain. It's literally what people see every day. So although the two Koreas are now divided, it's still very, very relevant. And the idea of, these nationalistic agendas that were incorporated into these images, like, for example, the Tangun myth, it's still very pervasive. And students, primary school students, are taught at a very early age that Tangun is the ancestor of the Korean people. So not much has changed in the way that the idea of the Korean nation state is formulated. And so I think this topic and this time period is still very, very relevant today. So I think that's the end of my presentation today. I hope it was relatable. I know that many of you are not, you don't have a background in art history or history for that matter, but if you have any questions or comments, I welcome you to speak up. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. It was a very interesting, meaningful lecture. I think it's not easy to talk about the history of a painting, of art, of a nation in an hour. Yes. In particular, it's not easy to condense all such a rich history between late 19th and early 20th. So it was very interesting. And then I'm very impressed of what Choi Nam-son said. I don't know, I feel Korean about Kumgangsan Mountain, but I'm very impressed. And you mentioned many topics, many issues, and I think in this moment in the world, the painting, the art, the history of art is becoming a kind of fashion, but we also know it's not easy to find someone experts about this field. So I think it was very interesting for our students because we really hope to introduce this university, in our university, introduce in the future a lecture or course related to art, painting. So I think our students appreciated this lecture absolutely. And I don't know if you have any question, curiosity. It's a great opportunity for you. I know many of you are interested to Korean painting, Korean art. So please.
Yes, if you have any questions, please feel free to ask me.
I have a microphone. Voi venire qui.
Thank you so much. It was a really fascinating lecture, so interesting. Actually, I'm a scenologist and I don't study Korean art, and it's a pity, I should really. And well, I'm sorry because I came a little late, so maybe you were explaining, talking a little about the link between, because I was impressed by many things, but while I'm quite interested in Chinese literati painting for more from how to speak. I'm not an expert of history of art, but while translating Qing time, Qing period literature, you find a lot. And so I was wondering, I found just in the paintings you were showing, I found some very interesting differences, I think. For instance, it was impressive to see, I noticed that in some literati paintings from Korea, there were the place names written. And I think this is very peculiar because it's like, I have the impression I haven't seen them in Chinese literati painting. And so it was quite peculiar. And so it was like among, not really this, but really the literati painting. It was really very nice to.
I like this.
Yes, this, and yes, this is impressive, I think. And so, there was also a very impressive quote. It was written, I think it was from the beginning, from the early 20th century book. The Chinese wish that they were born in this country so as to see this mountain. It was so nice to read it. Because of course there is something, a common, like a common view of aesthetic values, but of course there is something different. So I wonder whether you studied a little about this. Maybe you can say, explain a little more about these differences and peculiarities. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your question. Yes, in the topic of especially Joseon landscape paintings, I think. I am not an expert on Chinese literati painting, but especially towards in the early Joseon period, I think Chinese landscape paintings was really hugely influential to the formation of Joseon paintings. I think you mentioned the labeling custom is very interesting. This is. It doesn't take place in all of the literati paintings, but mostly in very famous spots, when depicting very famous spots. In the custom of painting Kumgangsan paintings, there's a name for it, Kumgangsan-do. This is very predominant because there are specific sites that are very popular. So they have all these different names. And pointing these places out, it basically adds to the reality of the landscape, and that is one of the ways why they did that. But I think I'm not 100% sure, but in many paintings of Chinese landscapes that Korean painters would paint, they also include these labels, because they wanted to express that they were depicting this very well-known site. In early Joseon paintings, for example, a lot of Korean painters or Joseon painters, they painted Chinese landscapes because China was a center of culture, basically. And so, although many of them had never been to China, they always depicted Chinese landscapes. And the way that they legitimized that landscape was through these labels. And that later on, it became really predominant in these genre paintings as well. So a lot of these genre paintings, they also include labels of, it's a very poor quality image, but they also include labels. And there's a lot of different reasonings for this, but this is something that you can see in maps, right? Obviously in maps, and they incorporated that into paintings. And I think that's a really interesting area. I'm sure that someone has studied this, but yes, thank you for pointing that out. I think the relationship between Chosun Korea and Ming and Qing China, I think, is one of the most popular topics of study because it has such a profound impact in not just art history, but just all areas of Chosun society. But yes, like you rightly pointed out, this power shift between Ming China and Qing China that really changed the way that Chosun society looked at China. In the 18th century in particular, Chosun, I don't know if you guys know, but Chosun Korea basically named themselves Little China. So they had this idea of 소중하, which is literally Little China. And they thought of themselves as the real China, right? So whereas Ming was, the most respected China, when Ming, was taken over by Qing, they refused to serve Qing, basically, as a cultural hegemony. And they took it upon themselves to continue the Ming traditions. And the way that they did that was, as I mentioned, through depicting Korean landscapes. And I think that, again, it flourished Korean art history in general. Yeah. So I would also be very interested to hear, your background on the take on Korean landscape as well. Yeah. Thank you. Yes.
I think watching the paintings on the mountains is sort of a healing. So I don't know. I'm wondering why you are specializing in the history in your research. I don't know. Your research is on the painting of these two mountains, in particular, Kumgangsan, Pectusa Mountains. I don't know. Actually, in this moment, you are specializing in these studies, or
so my thesis, my very recently finished doctoral thesis was on national representations of the Korean nation state. So it included a lot of different materials. So one was the flag, the national flag, and the imperial emblem, royal portraits, illustrations of historical figures, landscapes, maps, a lot of different things. This is part of chapter 4 of my thesis. But the reason why I decided to study this topic was because I have a background in international studies and also fine art. So I painted, actually, and then I changed to art history. So I'm always interested in how society and also international relationships they impact visual culture. And I think this period is the most dynamic, I think, because there were so many different changes and so many different political interests that were coexistent at the time. And that's one of the reasons why. So my thesis is very eclectic. So it has a lot of different material. If you're interested, it's online, so you can read it. Yes.
Yeah, because in this moment we can go to Kumgangsan or Pectusa, so it's the way to admire these mountains of Korean Peninsula. So it was very interesting. Any question?
First of all, thank you for your wonderful presentation. It was really nice and listen about the Korea and the Korean society, especially over the mountain. And I was wondering, is there any difference between the image of the mountain when we think about Hallasan or Kumgangsan, depending on the classes, social classes? For example, Yangban or artists, they can easily go, not easily, but can access in the mountain, but for normal people or just average people, they cannot go there easily. So I was wondering, is there any difference between the classes, let's say, about the mountain image?
Yeah. Oh, thank you. Thank you for the question. That question is a really interesting one because in the Joseon period, obviously there was a very strict strata of classes, social classes, and it was like you rightly pointed out, it was mostly the social elite that had access to the mountains, right? But even in these examples of images that I brought with me, these are by Cheongsan. This one is by Kim Ha-jong, who is also a professional painter. It was the most celebrated paintings of Kumgangsan Mountain were produced by professional painters. Professional painters in the Joseon period, they were never the Yangban elite. They were of the Chungin class, which is basically the working class. And so these prominent painters, often they would be professional court painters. They would be employed within the court, and they would accompany Yangban literati when they would go to Kumgangsan. But ordinary people also had access to these paintings because obviously these court painters would reproduce these paintings, right? Typically, I'm not sure if you guys know this, but typically when you paint these paintings, you have a primary template. These artists, they do sketches, right? And they use the templates to reproduce paintings over and over again. And there are records that prominent court painters of the Joseon period, they sold their paintings outside the court. One of the reasons is because they had a hard time making a living. So they needed money, so they would sell these outside of the court. And so through these reproductions, the ordinary common class, they would also have access to the paintings, and they would then emulate the paintings, right? So less prominent artists, outside the court, they would emulate the paintings. And this practice of emulating is a central part of painting practices in not just Korea, but in East Asia, right? So the idea of copying is a very predominant trend. And because of this, although there are executional differences in the technique of how to depict these paintings, this general style, I think, has a definite trend. So when it was Cheongsan's era, everyone painted in the style of Cheongsan, right? So he was a superstar even when he was alive. So everyone emulated the way that he painted. Of course, he was influenced by the Southern school of painting from China, right? So this kind of emulation was periodical. I didn't include the later ones by Kim Hong-do, but when Kim Hong-do, again, another generation, but when Kim Hong-do became popular, everyone's painted in the style of Kim Hong-do. So there is this kind of chronological trend in the style of painting, and there is this technical difference in the rendition of the paintings between the elite painters and the less elite painters. And yes, there are differences, but I think even in the case of genre paintings, the ultimate goal was to emulate the elite paintings, right? It wasn't this sense of, oh, we're going to create this new style of painting because we're commoners. They were always trying to emulate the elite. And I think that continues throughout Korean history, right? Even after the Joseon period. So yes, there are major differences in execution. And of course, like I mentioned, these genre paintings, obviously they look very, very different from Cheongsan paintings because they tend to exaggerate the features. Obviously, they also haven't been themselves. But I think I wouldn't describe this as a lack of skill. I would describe it as a way that these painters cater to the demands of their customers, right? So like you mentioned, because commoners didn't necessarily travel to Kumgangsan Mountain, they didn't really care if it looked like the real thing. They just wanted paintings of Kumgangsan in their house, right? So they wanted the paintings to be easily recognizable as Kumgangsan Mountain, and that's why there was this kind of huge exaggeration in expressions. But generally, I would say that the bigger framework is to emulate the elite paintings, and then throughout time, I think there are trends. And then in the realm of genre painting, I think towards the 19th century, there is this very specific type of painting that you could immediately see, you could immediately label as genre painting. So I think that, yes, that evolved toward the 19th century, I would say.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, any other questions? We have about 5 minutes. Nothing? Okay, so I think we can finish here. I think of starting from this seminar, we really want to collaborate with the SOAS, University of London, maybe by inviting the expert of the art. And I think we really want to thank you again. We hope to see you again here in Siena. Enjoy your journey.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.